The Blood in the Basement, My Grandfather's Secret Life. I grew up believing my grandfather was the kindest man alive. He was soft-spoken, always dressed neatly even when he worked in the garden, and never raised his voice at me. He smelled of tobacco smoke and old leather, and his laugh carried through the house like a lullaby. I adored him, trusted him, and believed he was a figure of safety in a world that sometimes felt too big for me to understand. But now, as I write this, I know that every memory I hold of him is poisoned. Every smile, every lesson, every bedtime story hides something rotten, and I need to tell you everything, because if I don't, I feel like the truth will bury me the way it buried so many others. My earliest memory of him is simple. I was sitting at his feet in the living room while he polished an old pocket knife. The steel glistened in the lamplight, and I asked him why he kept it so sharp if he didn't use it for cooking or carving wood. He leaned down, smiled at me, and said, "A blade is like a memory. It dulls if you don't tend to it." At the time, I thought it was just one of his strange sayings. Looking back, I wonder how many hidden meanings he left scattered through my childhood, waiting for me to discover them too late. There was always one part of his house that was forbidden, the basement. The door was always locked, a heavy iron key resting on a chain he wore around his neck. I asked once what was down there, and he ruffled my hair and said, "Just old junk. Nothing you'd want to see." But children are naturally curious, and being told no only made my imagination run wilder. I dreamed of hidden treasure, of secret maps, of machines he was secretly building. I never expected what I would eventually find. When I was 12, the lock on the basement door was left undone. It must have been an accident, because he was always so careful. I still remember the thrill of wrapping my fingers around the doorknob and feeling it turn without resistance. I hesitated, because a part of me knew I was breaking a rule, but my curiosity was stronger. The air that greeted me was cold and metallic. Dust motes floated in a narrow beam of light from a small window high on the wall. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each creak echoing like a warning. At first glance, it looked almost normal. Shelves stacked with boxes, tools neatly arranged on the wall, jars of screws and nails. But then I noticed how sharp and heavy those tools were. Meat cleavers, saws, axes, each cleaned and gleaming as if they were regularly used and carefully maintained. And then I saw the photographs. There were dozens of them, arranged on a shelf like a shrine. Old black and white portraits, Polaroids, and faded color prints. Men, women, children, strangers I had never met. Each face was crossed out with a single stroke of red ink. Some of the photos were stained, others torn at the edges, but all of them had that same cruel mark, as if my grandfather had wanted to erase them from existence. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at them. I told myself it was a collection, maybe some weird hobby, maybe he bought them at flea markets. But deep down, I felt something darker stirring. I remember reaching out to touch one of the photographs, a young woman with bright eyes and a nervous smile, when a voice behind me made me freeze. "What are you doing down here?" It was him, my grandfather. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried an edge that made my stomach twist. I turned to see him standing at the bottom of the stairs, the light casting shadows across his face. He didn't look angry, just tired. I stammered some excuse about exploring, about being curious. He walked past me slowly, picked up the photograph I had touched, and held it in his hands. His fingers trembled as he stared at it, and then he gave me a smile I will never forget. You're too young to understand, he said quietly, but one day you'll see. He led me upstairs without another word, locked the basement behind us, and never mentioned it again. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The images of those crossed out faces burned in my mind. Years passed. Life carried on. I grew older, busier, distracted by school, friends, and eventually work. My grandfather aged too, becoming frailer, quieter, his once steady hands now trembling constantly. The memory of the basement became something I pushed into the back of my mind, convincing myself it was nothing, that I had overreacted, that maybe the photographs were just something strange from his past. But when he died, everything came back. It was after the funeral, when my father handed me a wooden chest. "Your grandfather wanted you to have this," he said. The chest was old, its brass hinges tarnished, the wood scratched with age. I opened it expecting keepsakes, maybe his watch, maybe letters or trinkets. What I found instead froze my blood. Inside were stacks of notebook. I couldn't stop reading. Every entry, every line, every description felt like a pulse in my chest, a whisper in my ear, a shadow moving across the walls of my own house. He wrote about towns he had visited, how he observed people in cafes, parks, and at bus stops, how he memorized their routines, the pattern of their steps, the way their hands shook when they were nervous. He described studying faces in mirrors at night, practicing expressions, learning how to hide the darkness that bubbled beneath his ordinary exterior. I remember one particular notebook entry that made me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the void. He wrote about a family he had watched for weeks, a mother, father, and a young girl. He described their house, the smell of their kitchen, the sound of the mother humming as she did the dishes. Then he wrote about how he waited for the perfect night, how he felt alive, completely alive, as he crept into their lives unseen. The passage ended with a single chilling sentence. They never knew it was me until it was too late. I began to piece together a timeline. Names from the photographs in the basement matched entries in the notebooks. Newspaper clippings were stacked neatly in the chest, each annotated with notes in his handwriting. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that my grandfather had been meticulous. He had planned everything with precision, and he had always avoided suspicion. His neighbors adored him. The local store clerk trusted him. Even my family had no idea. As the night grew darker, I felt as if someone was watching me. The shadows of my room seemed to stretch and bend. The floorboards creaked in the hallway outside, and the wind rattled the window panes. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, a reaction to the horror I had unearthed. But then I remembered something from my childhood, a detail I had long dismissed. When I was about 10, I had woken up in the middle of the night to find my grandfather standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me. I had been paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. He whispered, "Do you see now? The world isn't what it seems." Then he turned and left, closing the door silently behind him. At the time, I had thought it was a nightmare. Now I realized it had been a warning. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed. I pored over every notebook, every letter, every photograph. I traced the names, researched the towns, and tried to understand the pattern of his life. He had been everywhere, yet nowhere. Always the quiet observer, the smiling neighbor, the grandfather everyone trusted. And all the while, he had been hiding a darkness so profound that it made my own existence feel fragile by comparison. I began to notice the subtle details of his life that I had once ignored: the locked drawers, the heavy safe in his study, the smell of iron that sometimes lingered in his clothes. Every memory I had of him now carried a new weight. The bedtime stories about wandering in the woods, the lessons about tracking animals, the games in which he taught me to be quiet and still. All of it had been training, or so it seemed in retrospect. One night, I had a dream that has haunted me ever since. I was standing in the basement, surrounded by the photographs. They whispered my name, their voices rising and falling in a chorus of fear and accusation. I saw my grandfather's face in every shadow, smiling at me, beckoning me closer. I woke up in a cold sweat, the notebooks sprawled across my bed as if they had fallen from my mind into the real world. It wasn't just the discovery that changed me, it was the inheritance, the knowledge that this secret, this darkness, had been passed down to me, that the man who raised me had chosen me to understand, to carry the memory of what he had done. And somewhere deep inside, I feared the implications of that inheritance. I began to see patterns in my own behavior that I had never noticed before. The thrill of observing others, the fascination with small details, the way I sometimes felt alive in moments of quiet calculation. I hated myself for noticing, hated myself for the creeping recognition that I might share some of his instincts, even if only in small, subconscious ways. One evening, I returned to the basement, though I hadn't intended to. The lock on the door had rusted slightly with age, and I found it easier to turn than I had anticipated. The air was heavier than I remembered, filled with the scent of old wood and faint metal. The shelves were just as I had left them, but the photographs seemed different somehow, more alive. The red marks on the faces seemed to pulse in the dim light. I found myself staring at a photograph of a man I did not recognize, but the eyes in the photo seemed to look through me, past me, into some part of myself I had never wanted to see. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. And then I noticed something else. Small scratches in the floorboards, like the movement of someone pacing, careful and deliberate. I wasn't alone. My grandfather's presence was everywhere in that room, though he had been dead for months. Every object, every note, every photograph carried him. And yet the air seemed to carry an echo of his footsteps, the brush of his hand along the tools. I don't know if it was my imagination, or if the house itself remembered him, but I felt eyes on me. I spent hours there, unable to leave, drawn to the objects, the notebooks, the whispers of a life I had never truly known. I read letters describing nights when he followed someone through the streets, through alleys, through fields, observing, waiting, calculating. I read entries about faces frozen in terror, bodies discovered days later, and the exhilaration he felt in moments of absolute control. It made me question everything I thought I knew about morality, about good and evil, about the thin veneer of civility that masks what people are truly capable of. My grandfather had lived a double life, and in doing so, had shown me that anyone at all, could hide a darkness if they were careful enough. The days turned into weeks. I stopped sleeping properly, haunted by the notebooks, the photographs, and the faint sound of footsteps that seemed to echo through my house at night. I began to notice people differently, strangers on the street, neighbors, friends. Every glance, every smile, every small action was a potential mask hiding a secret. And I couldn't stop thinking about my grandfather, about how he had done it, how he had lived among them, and how he had chosen me to see it all. One night, I found myself speaking aloud to the photographs as if they were alive. I whispered apologies, confessions, questions, and I swear I heard something whisper back. Not words I could understand, just a feeling, cold, distant, and impossibly ancient. That was when I realized the truth. I had inherited more than just knowledge. I had inherited a presence, a shadow that lingered long after my grandfather's death. It wasn't just memory, it was influence. A part of him had seeped into the walls, into the air, into the way I saw the world. And it was patient, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the photographs, reading his words, feeling the weight of his gaze. I only know that when I finally left the basement, I wasn't the same person who had entered, and I understood something I had tried to ignore for years. The line between observer and participant is thinner than you think. Every life he ended, every secret he kept, was a lesson. And now, those lessons were mine to bear. I don't know if I will ever be able to explain this to anyone else, to my family, to my friends, to the world. But I know this. My grandfather was a serial killer. He lived among us, smiled at us, taught me how to tie my shoes and ride a bike, and yet he carried death in his hands. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of my mind, I feel him still, guiding me, watching me, reminding me that some truths are never truly gone. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement, about the photographs, about the notebooks that smelled of old leather and ink. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces staring at me. Sometimes they seemed angry, sometimes terrified, sometimes alive. And every time I felt my grandfather's presence behind me, silent and patient, as if he had been waiting for me to understand. I started keeping a journal of my own, trying to process what I had discovered. Writing the words down made it feel real, made the weight on my chest slightly more bearable. I wrote about my childhood, my memories of him, the strange lessons, and the stories that had always felt too real. I wrote about the basement, the photographs, and the notebooks. And as I wrote, I noticed patterns, small details I had missed before. The way he had always lingered near windows at night, how he seemed to know who would walk by and when, the way he had taught me to be still and silent. One evening, I found a small envelope tucked behind one of the books in the chest. Inside was a key, old and tarnished, and a single note in his handwriting. For when you are ready. My hands shook as I held it. I knew immediately it was for the basement. He had left it for me, knowing I would find it eventually. The thought made me nauseous. Did he trust me? Did he want me to continue? Or was it a test, a way to see if I would succumb to curiosity, as he had? I waited for weeks before I used the key. I couldn't bring myself to go down there, to face the ghosts and memories. But one night, drawn by a mixture of dread and compulsion, I descended the stairs. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled